Good afternoon, class. Checking in. I told you at the end of our time together today that I'd be making some additional comments, and we spent a little more than I expected today, but hopefully it was meaningful conversation, meaningful dialogue about the recent attacks in Paris over this past weekend, and what, if anything, they had to say or do with some of the challenges that we've experienced as we've studied thus far the last couple hundred years of world history. We started with the classical liberal tradition and talked about how, in many respects, conflicts like the ones that we're experiencing, when we look at the emergence of a terror organization like ISIS, it is one response, one of many, to some of the main issues that have been at play in the world for much of the last 200 years. So thank you for your time with that, and I hope it was meaningful and maybe challenge you to think a little bit about how our world today is tied to the world of yesterday and the day before. Okay, so let me fast forward. We started talking about the Holocaust, the Nazi Holocaust during World War II, and I left off today. I got a little bit of a ways in, but I was trying to suggest to you that the historical experience of the Jewish people going back at least a couple thousand years, and perhaps even earlier, has been one where there have been cycles of violence and discrimination and intolerance shown by various groups, oftentimes majorities, outside the Jewish population. There have been instances, almost cyclical, almost predictable instances of frustration, anger, and intolerance expressed toward the Jews. But I wanted to suggest to you that there have been some meaningful changes that have happened. Anti-Semitism is not exactly new. But the old anti-Semitism, the anti-Semitism that was a part of the Jewish experience going back to the time of Jesus, tended to be an anti-Semitism that was rooted more in religious concerns, and it was one of, I said, somewhat simply, the idea that Christians or other religious majorities would fault the Jewish people for their perceived role in the death of Jesus, and that therefore angst, anger, discrimination, and violence carried out against the Jews was therefore somehow justified. Well, that might speak to the experience of Jewish people during problematic periods such as the Crusades, or going back to the Inquisition under the Spanish Catholic Church, so on and so forth. But a newer form of anti-Semitism really emerged during the 20th century, and Adolf Hitler is perhaps the face of it, although he's not the only practitioner of this newer style of anti-Semitism. But folks like Hitler came to think of the Jewish people and regard them with something close to a scientific racism, meaning they tried to ground their racist thoughts, actions, and messages in a scientific basis. Now, the idea, you'll notice here I've put the term racial in quotes because the Jewish people are not a race. They're not a DNA sequence that can somehow be distinguished from the rest of other types of people in the world. In fact, I think I mentioned last week that the idea of race really has no scientific basis to it. But nonetheless, at best, the Jewish people are an ethnic group. Nonetheless, this didn't stop people like Hitler and other architects of the social policies of Nazi Germany from viewing them as such. And we'll see as you track your experience as a young boy or girl moving through Nazi Germany, you'll understand how that was expressed. Another thing I want to say is that in the newer versions of anti-Semitism. There was this idea that the Jewish people, by definition, there was something in their, again, racial makeup that made them unusually acquisitive, meaning that they were somehow greedy or stingy with their money, and that they were looking to take advantage of other people and hoard wealth and resources to their benefit and other people's exclusions. And these were examples of messages that were being used to try to drive home this idea of the Jewish people as a somehow pathological group. Finally, you can't see this, it's just off the screen, but I've already talked to you about how Hitler used the stab in the back theory, which this poster here on this slide is suggesting that there was somehow an enemy among the German people, and this enemy was the Jewish people, who, in Hitler's opinion, were actively scheming to bring about and undermine the potential of the German people. Again, World War I wasn't a military loss, it was a loss of political will. The people at home, many Jews among them, were unwilling to support the German government, the king, Kaiser Wilhelm, in his effort to bring about victory during World War I. So anti-Semitism is changing at this time. Okay, so here you are, you're a young man, and you are in a prominent Jewish family. Let's say you're living in Berlin. Your father is a successful physician. He's a professional within Berlin. And again, Germany is a wonderful place to be. But here you are, you're coming home for dinner. You're having conversations with your family around the table. And you start to notice that mom and dad look a little bit anxious, a little concerned. You hear them discussing developments here in the early 1930s, concerns about a changing government, some government developments within Germany, and you start hearing reference to a man named Hitler. Your father is very worried, visibly worried, and your mom, largely because your father's worried, she is worried as well. You don't fully understand it. You don't put a whole lot of stock in it at first. But you are mildly troubled by the fact that mom and dad seem to be quite uneasy. And what's happening is the National Socialist Party, or the Nazis, is forming inside of Germany, and rather sudden developments. Germany, like the rest of the world, has been wrestling with global recession. Times have been hard. They've really not been that much more difficult in Germany than in other parts of Europe, because the debt that Germany owes to neighboring governments throughout Europe, that has been suspended for the time being, and we'll see what will happen. But these are anxious times, and people are looking for solutions, and they're hoping that solutions will be forthcoming. But this has also given rise to new political leaders, and this very outspoken Adolf Hitler seems to be one of them. And I want to just briefly note the National Socialist Party, the Nazis. I want to point out it seems like in some ways a paradox, because you have the nationalists and the socialists, which really doesn't seem to be a very agreeable term. But perhaps the best way to describe it is to say that whereas Marx, the author of socialism, which evolves toward communism, viewed the fate and the future of the industrial world as a class struggle, Hitler sees the future of the German world, and to some degree the industrial world, not as a class struggle, but as a nation struggle, meaning the nation, the true wholesome essence of Germany, the good Aryan German stock, they are engaged in a struggle against other nations inside of Germany. Nations being people with a certain culture, history, language, religion, so on and so forth. And so Hitler neatly places Jews, gypsies, homosexuals, folks like that outside of the nation of Germany. And therefore, it's the true German nation that needs to struggle against these other minorities that are compromising and undermining the German government and German society. So the National Socialists, the Nazis, become that party. By 1932, Hitler has risen and become the Chancellor, which is a high-ranking position inside the German government. He is a National Socialist. He's a member of the Nazi Party. The German government as a whole is not yet a Nazi-run organization. The Weimar Republic is still in place. But Hitler earns a very important and powerful post, and it becomes the first step towards toward a full-on Nazi occupation of the German government. Hitler made a lot of people nervous in the early 1930s, but they did not stop him until it was too late and until he had consolidated power unto himself. In 1933, the president of Germany, the head of the Weimar Republic government, dies, von Hindenburg, and Hitler is able to consolidate, so he is not just the Chancellor of Germany, to now being the head of Germany itself. And so by combining these two roles, he becomes the Führer. Your family is very concerned by these developments. By 1933, it appears as though Germany is heading very dramatically in a new direction, and in the direction that your father knows very well does not bode well for the Jewish people within Germany. And you're actually even starting to feel this when you go to class. You're starting to sense that some of your fellow students, kids that you once got along with well, are starting to distance themselves from you. And this discomfort that you first noticed with your mom and dad now seems as though it's visited itself in some ways upon you in somewhat direct ways. Sorry, okay. So this gives way by the mid-1930s. You're now 13, 14. Unfortunately, adolescence is now visiting itself strongly upon you. Some of the insecurity and dis-ease that you feel at this time is occurring amidst very troubling events within the country of Germany as well. You start to notice that at school, in your science classes, biology, so on and so forth, you're starting to see that teachers are organizing lessons, some of which are very embarrassing and just outright mean-spirited, where teachers will do things like measure the length of your nose or your ears and conduct these sort of like laboratory experiments to demonstrate the differences between Jewish people and those people of pure Aryan stock. You really start to feel like school is no longer a comfortable place for you. Your parents are very concerned about some of your development, your self-esteem. You're starting to have fewer friends. Very few people ask to do anything with you after school or on weekends, so on and so forth. So the anti-Semitism of the larger German culture is starting to find its way into your, even into your school lessons. And you notice that there are organizations such as the picture shown here of Hitler Youth, where young people age 14, 15, your classmates, are getting together after school and learning highly patriotic and nationalist messages, keeping with the Nazi Party. Some of them are being prepared to even be part of a special police force organized by the National Socialist Party. Let me close here, and then I'm going to link to a second screencast that I've recorded earlier, actually last year. But the Nuremberg laws are an important crossover. In 1935, your family starts to have major restrictions placed upon it. Oops. Your father, who is a medical professional, he is at first told that he can only, he has to put a Star of David on his business so that everyone who walks by knows that it's a Jewish owned and operated practice. He also, you start to go by the label of Israel, or your sister goes by Sarah. and we'll stop there.